Hello and welcome to the official start of today's World Oregon webinar on the Poseidon project, the struggle to govern the world's oceans, with Professor David Bosco, who I'll introduce in just a minute, joining me on screen. And just a few words of welcome for our first webinar of 2022. Happy New Year. I hope you are staying as healthy as possible. For obvious reasons, we are continuing with our virtual webinars, given the state of the virus and the variants, and we wish you good health in this challenging time. I'll say a little bit more about today's program in just a minute. First, a big thank you to all of those who have recently renewed your membership or gave a donation at the end of calendar year 2021. It was a huge help for us, and we greatly appreciate your support. If you haven't had a chance lately to renew your membership, today is a great day to do it because starting tomorrow, you may have heard, is our Great Decision series. The 8-part series we do annually with the Foreign Policy Association. I will post in a little bit on the chat the link for the series registration. We have a special price of $30 for all 8 talks that Tim DeRoche, my colleague, has curated. Should be a fascinating series of sessions. And something new we're trying this year, some discussion groups with Portland State University grad students. So we're really excited about that. That kicks off tomorrow at noon. So again, we'll post this in the chat. And David is also being sort of our guinea pig for something else we're trying today, which is, you will see later on in the program, a Zoom survey where we're really trying to get your feedback. There's both sort of qualitative about the event, but also quantitative with some optional demographic information as part of our diversity, equity, inclusion efforts to have a better understanding who our audience is and how we're connecting or not yet connecting with audience. So appreciate your participation in that short survey, which Tim's posting in the chat. Now to today's program. Today's program is with David Bosco, who is an associate professor of international studies at Indiana University's Hamilton Lugar School of Global International Studies. And for those of you who are older like me, those names will ring out to you, and there are some notable past senators and congressmen from the great state of Indiana. He's going to talk today about his latest book, which is The Poseidon Project, the Struggle to Govern the World's Oceans. David has a real specialty in multilateral issues and has previously written books on the UN Security Council, 5 to Rule Them All, and the International Criminal Court, Rough Justice. So, and he talks all about these issues and other multilateral issues on his blog called the Multilateralist blog, which is a Substack newsletter. So we will post links in just a minute to how you can buy his latest book from our partner Broadway Books, as well as sign up for his blog. He writes on other places. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School, has practiced law. He's quite a talented man. We're excited to have him here. Has a strong Twitter following also. So if you're on social media, join him on Twitter. And without further ado, David, the floor is yours. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Derek. It's really great to be with you and to be with such a great group. I thought maybe I'd say a few words about the book project and kind of how it came about. And I might start with an incident that occurred during one of my research trips for the book. And there weren't as many research trips for the book as I had hoped because COVID obviously intervened. But I spent a couple of weeks in Japan talking to a number of different Japanese officials about maritime issues. And I was meeting with some Coast Guard officials to look at how the Japanese Coast Guard is operating. And with me was a Japanese official from the Prime Minister's office who was kind of acting as a liaison to help me through the process. And I was very struck. I was listening to the Coast Guard officials talk about, their various operations and how they are deployed. And suddenly the cell phone, the official cell phone of the guy from the Prime Minister's office started giving off this kind of alarm sound in the middle of our meeting. And I kind of looked over and I was, thinking, what is that? And, it went off after a few minutes and I didn't think much more about it. Afterwards, though, I asked him what that was. And he said there had been an incursion by Chinese ships near the Senkaku Islands, so that these ships had crossed over from the open ocean into the territorial waters of the Senkaku Islands. And because that is an extremely sensitive issue for Japan, the Prime Minister's office makes sure that whenever that happens, everybody in the office knows about it in real time, so that they're aware that there's a possible confrontation brewing. So that was a very striking moment, kind of while we were talking about these broad maritime issues, to have the real-time maritime friction kind of intervene. And of course, as I think most of the listeners will know, the maritime tensions in Asian waters have been very striking in recent years. Some of that is about the status of the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea, which are administered by Japan, but claimed by China. But even more dangerous in some respects are the tensions in the South China Sea, where you've got a number of different claimants. China obviously has taken a very aggressive stance toward the South China Sea, but the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, other countries, Taiwan itself has claims, of course. And there is, I think it's no exaggeration to say that these maritime frictions in the South China Sea and the East China Sea are seen by many as a very plausible trigger to major power conflict. And in the book, I talk about a war game simulation that was run in 2020 by a leading think tank, which began with a Chinese effort to take the Senkaku Islands, and according to the way the war game played out, escalated fairly quickly into a conflict directly between Chinese and U.S. naval forces. And I don't think I have to say much more about how serious that would be. So that's a bit of kind of the modern day backdrop here about maritime frictions. And there certainly are a number of other issues that we could point to, and I hope we'll get a chance to talk about. The way that these frictions are often discussed, and particularly if you listen to the rhetoric from the United States, they are often framed as a question of freedom of the seas. That the United States is, with some of its allies, is trying to defend freedom of the seas in these waters against claims by other countries, China obviously being the leading country, that wants to claim more of the waters than they should. And according to the United States, more of the waters than international law allows. So in large part, I think what I'm trying to do in this book is to talk about the idea of freedom of the seas and where that came from and how that has evolved over time, and how it is playing out in the modern day world. And I'd maybe mention one other incident, here going back in history to talk about the idea of freedom of the seas. And that was a maritime clash between the Dutch and the Portuguese. And this occurred in the early 1600s as the Dutch were trying to break into the lucrative spice trade in the Indian Ocean. Now, one of the things that had happened in the 1500s, essentially, is that Spain and Portugal had more or less, as kind of the leading countries in ocean exploration, had more or less tried to divide up the oceans between themselves. And this was kind of formalized in the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas. Well, the Dutch obviously were not going to be comfortable with this arrangement. And after a couple of attempts to break into the Indian Ocean spice trade, when they were then kind of punished or chased out by the Portuguese, the Dutch staged an incident where they waited for a Portuguese ship, seized it, sailed it back to Amsterdam, auctioned off its contents for a rather princely sum, and they then faced the reality that they needed to explain and justify what they had done to the international community, such as it existed at that point. And it was out of that that we got the first real full elaboration of the doctrine of freedom of the seas. And this came from the pen of Hugo Grotius, who was a pretty precocious young lawyer, kind of a child, almost like a child prodigy. I think he was 21 or 22 when he was tasked by the Dutch with writing a legal defense of what they had done. But his legal defense, which came out in a pamphlet in 1609 called Mare Liberum, or the Free Sea, was really the full elaboration of this idea that the oceans should be free for all to use, and that they should not be subject to the ownership of any particular country. And over the centuries, that freedom of the seas doctrine has become a very powerful, very resonant way of thinking of the oceans. And it obviously still resonates. Okay, it still resonates to some degree in international law, although maybe less than some people think. But it resonates rhetorically. And if you look, for example, at statements by US officials, US presidents over the years, freedom of the seas is seen as something very fundamental to the US national interest. But what exactly is that doctrine, and is it a viable doctrine in this day and age? That's something I try to explore in the book. And I argue that, in fact, if we look at what has happened, particularly since World War II, many of the basic pillars of freedom of the seas have started to crumble. And so the doctrine is actually very much in doubt for a variety of reasons. Some of those reasons have to do with military conflict and what can be done during military conflict. If we look, for example, at World War I and World War II, you see vast enclosures, or I should say closures, of maritime space during those wars. And we saw things like, obviously, unrestricted submarine warfare, but also attempts to have huge maritime blockades. And that very much flew in the face of the Grotian doctrine of freedom of the seas. And that, I would argue, that the expectation would be that in any future naval conflicts, we would see, again, massive closures of the ocean to maritime commerce. Other ways in which freedom of the seas has started to crumble are on the environmental front, and for very good reason. When Grotius was writing, his view was that the resources of the ocean were inexhaustible, that one country fishing somewhere couldn't possibly matter to another country because the resources of the ocean were so plentiful. Well, the modern world has shown that not to be the case, and fish stocks have become endangered in a number of parts of the world. And it's not just about fish stocks, it's also about other marine resources, and it's about really the health of the oceans overall. So the idea that free use of the oceans is a kind of viable way forward, I think, has come very much under question. And one of the dramas that's kind of threaded through the story is the legal drama of the attempt to write a new rule book for the oceans, which has elements of that Grotian doctrine of freedom of the seas, but also takes into account some of the ways in which freedom of the seas is not really viable. And that, of course, is the embodiment of that is the Convention on the Law of the Sea, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which was negotiated during the 1980s and came into force in the 1990s, and is really a massive international effort to kind of strike a compromise on how we're going to govern the oceans. One of the realities, I think, though, and I think the last decade really has brought this into relief, is that there is a lot of pressure building on that compromise in a number of different ways. I mean, China's assertions in the South China Sea are one, and probably the most notable. We have here the second power, essentially, in the international system, which is if not directly violating, certainly putting great strain on the legal framework by its claims in the South China Sea. Now, you will get Chinese explanations that insist that their policies in the South China Sea are consistent with the rule book. I think those are very hard to maintain, and it's really best to see the Chinese policy in the South China Sea as a real challenge to the international rules. But there are other ways in which this is playing out as well, some that are getting a little bit less attention. But in the Arctic, we have real tension over the status of, for example, the Northwest Passage. And on the Russian kind of fringe of the Arctic, the Northern Sea Route, there is legal controversy over whether those routes, which may become more and more viable as the ice recedes, whether those should be seen as international straits, essentially international transit routes, or whether they should be seen as under the control of the Canadian and Russian governments, respectively. Then we've got other areas of tension, including in the Mediterranean, between Greece and Turkey in the Black Sea. Turkey and Russia have both seemed to make assertions, although rather vague, that would seem to be in contradiction to the existing rules on the oceans. And then we've got a fascinating drama playing out on the seabed. And here the question is the mining, possible mining, commercial mining of the international seabed, and whether that can be effectively regulated by international authorities, and whether the resources that are generated from any commercial mining of the seabed can be shared with the international community, which was the vision that was put into the UN convention that I mentioned. So there are an awful lot of points of pressure on the existing legal framework for the oceans. And I'd love to discuss many of those with participants. Maybe I will kind of wrap up my comments there to sort of make sure that we have ample time for discussion and back and forth on this. But I just wanted to thank everybody for the opportunity. This is something I really look forward to.
Great. Thanks, David. This is Tim DeRoche, the Director of Programs at World Oregon. David, fantastic book. And you bring up a lot of great issues. I'd like to just kind of dive in with a few questions and then invite the audience. Please give us your questions, put them into the Q&A function on your Zoom screen, not the chat. And that makes it easier for us to fetch and pass them on. So David, you got at this a little bit, but between 1945 and now, the political organization of the world has undergone very radical change. I mean, largely due to decolonization movements. How has that really extended to our thinking about the governance of the oceans? And do you think that world powers are still framing and mapping the quote unquote freedom of the seas through an outdated resource-driven and colonial lens?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you brought that up. Just as you say, and this is sometimes gets glossed over when we talk about international law, we talk about institutions like the UN or multilateral treaties, just how much the world changed, say, between 1945, when a lot of this architecture was built, and say the late 1960s. Because as we had the rapid decolonization of Africa, parts of Asia, you saw this entry of newly independent states into these multilateral organizations and processes that they weren't part of at the creation, and they didn't really have a say in. And one of the things I track in the book is in looking at the conference records from these various maritime, multilateral sessions, you start to see, as we get to the early 1960s, a lot of diplomats from these newly independent countries saying, in essence, you keep talking about freedom of the seas, and you keep talking about Grotius, and you keep talking about how important that is. We've noted, I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but we've noticed that freedom of the seas seemed to go hand in hand with colonial exploitation. And what was for you freedom of the seas was really the use of the oceans to, take resources, take control of areas. Obviously, freedom of the seas played a big role in the slave trade. For many, many years, freedom of the seas was thought to encompass the freedom to transport enslaved people through over the oceans. So you do get a real pushback, and that is why there is this alternative conception that has been put forward with a lot of support from newly independent countries, the developing world, the G77, however exactly you want to describe this constellation of states. But they have said we need to replace freedom of the seas essentially with an alternative idea, which is that the oceans are the common heritage of mankind, was the way the formulation was originally used. Most of us would say the common heritage of humanity now, that the oceans should be used on behalf of the international community and not just for the rich advanced countries that are able to exploit the ocean. And the area where the rubber really hits the road is this seabed mining question. Because the compromise that was built into the UN convention was that there was going to be, yes, countries could mine the seabed, but it had to be done under international control, and there had to be some profit sharing with the international community. So that if, let's say a British company wants to go down and pull cobalt off of the seabed, maybe they can do that, but they're going to have to pay a certain amount into the International Seabed Authority, and that then gets distributed to the international community as a whole. We are about to see whether this can work, because commercial mining of the seabed is really just on the cusp of becoming a reality. And so this whole idea of using ocean resources on behalf of the international community as a whole is going to get its first real test in the coming years, and it's not at all a given, I think, that this system is going to work or be seen as workable by the countries that need to participate in it.
So I'm curious, were you able to attend Glasgow?
I was not. I had several colleagues in my department who were, but I was not able to attend.
Well, one of the rallying cries I heard from the Glasgow summit was ocean action is climate action. Mm-hmm. But what were, in your opinion, the main outcomes around the ocean climate nexus that came out of COP26?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in some ways, the ocean is is kind of a victim there are lots of victims in the climate change story, but the ocean, of course, as a kind of functionally as a carbon sink has acted as kind of a recipient for a lot of the emissions, and then we have the rising sea levels and the increase in temperature, in ocean temperature. And there has been the idea, and this didn't get a lot of attention at Glasgow, but there has been the idea of trying to use the oceans as a mitigation method for climate change. And one of the ideas that has been out there has been the idea of trying to fertilize the ocean with iron so that it will absorb more CO2 and thereby help defray some of the or mitigate some of climate change. That idea, I think, mercifully has kind of passed. But right now, I would say ocean issues are, in many, many respects, being seen as part of the climate change story. But in some ways, you can't separate it out from aspects of climate change. And so I saw the main things coming out of Glasgow as not directly related to the oceans. The things that I think were most consequential were about coal, were the general emissions reductions strategy framework, but not directly related to oceans.
Well, so in August, the Oregon Global Warming Commission, recognizing that coastal and marine habitats are in many ways the canary in the climate change coal mine, adopted a proposal that is one of the nation's first to explicitly account for carbon sequestration powers in coastal habitats, what they're calling blue carbon. What do you think we can do to encourage more countries and regions to leverage the climate change fighting potential of these natural carbon sinks?
Yeah. Well, here, one of the ideas that is out there and that I think has been seized on by a number of countries is the idea of marine protected areas. So that we essentially designate large areas as marine protected areas. And that is seen as having a number of different benefits, but including some benefits on the climate front. Now, there are some interesting legal questions that arise when you start to talk about marine protected areas. If you're talking about doing it, say, within the national waters of a country, or even if we go beyond the 12-mile territorial sea out into, let's say, the 200-mile exclusive economic zone, there you're on pretty firm legal ground to say we can make this a marine protected area. We can impose these all sorts of restrictions and try to regulate activities. The trick has been beyond that 200 miles. How do we try to set up marine protections, or as you say, leverage the oceans for climate purposes when we're talking about beyond the 200 miles? And what a number of countries have tried to do is set up marine protected areas on the high seas, so out beyond 200 miles. But the way that they have to do it is through what you might call like plurilateral agreements with other ocean users, right? So you get 10 or 12 countries together that, let's say, might use a part of the ocean, and they all agree to restrict their activities or to use that part of the ocean in a certain way. The legal problem is those 10 or 12 countries can't necessarily prevent some other country that has not signed on to that plurilateral agreement from coming in and using that portion of the oceans in a way that might be out of step. I talked in the book a bit about an effort to create a high seas marine protected area in the Ross Sea near Antarctica. And this was essentially the model that was followed, where you had about a dozen countries agree to try to keep an area of the Ross Sea, essentially pristine. And but they have acknowledged that they can't, legally speaking, prevent some outsider who wasn't part of that agreement from coming in and using the oceans. And I think that is why one of the things you've got going on now, which is quite important, is a big negotiation at the UN on further regulation of the high seas. It's known as the BBNJ process, biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. And so that is right now a forum for a lot of thinking about how the oceans can be protected, but also leveraged in certain ways to deal with broader environmental issues.
Well, that's kind of interesting, because that brings up the same, I mean, I think about this a lot, and I think you and I had a little brief exchange about this, but Great Decision starts tomorrow, and we are looking at outer space policy. And in many ways, with the seas and with space, you are looking at that question of maintaining pristineness and non-ownership, but privatization is really changing the equation there. And so, do you see an overlap between high seas policy and how we're thinking about space?
Yeah, I think there is some real overlap. And, if you think about space, and I'm certainly not an expert yet on space policy, but, you see some of the same language pop up in the international agreements for outer space. They talk about the common heritage of mankind. They talk about the use of space only for peaceful purposes. And these are phrases and words that come up in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea as well. Now, that privatization is an interesting point, and I guess there are a couple ways of thinking about that. Normally, the way that international law works, you are talking about private actors, but those private actors have to be responsible ultimately to some sovereign government. And that therefore there has to be some state that is ultimately responsible. Now, where I think things get really interesting, and I haven't seen yet how this is played out in space, but on the oceans, one of the big regulatory problems is what is the system of flags of convenience, where you've got governments that are flagging vessels, privately owned vessels, but that government may have very little connection in real terms with that company, that ocean-going company. And therefore very little incentive to really effectively regulate what they're doing. And this, pops up again and again in the book, is a big governance problem for the oceans. I think it'll be fascinating to see whether that flag of convenience system starts to emerge in terms of space. Right now, at least as I understand it, things are fairly clear in that, okay, this is a US company regulated by the United States, or this is a Russian company, or and obviously you still got plenty of actual government enterprises doing space exploration. But what happens if, say the government, some government says, we're going to sponsor a space enterprise, it's going to be private, but we're going to be the flag on it, essentially. Then you get into some of those same governance problems that you've had on the oceans. And so it will be interesting to see whether that dynamic emerges in space as well.
So you bring up sovereign rights. A common statistic cited at COP26 was that 80% of the world's biodiversity is protected by indigenous people, who represent only 5% of the global population. Oceans and coastal regions certainly figure very, very heavily into that. Yeah. How represented do you think the indigenous voice is in the international dialogue around the future of oceans? And see that being supported by other world powers?
I would say not well represented, although with that said, there is one innovation that is worth mentioning here. But if you want to, say how well were indigenous voices represented, say at the negotiations of UNCLOS, or even in ongoing discussions about maritime issues at the multilateral level, I would say not well represented. But the one exception is one of the newer multilateral instruments that deals in part with the oceans, and that is the Arctic Council. And the Arctic Council was set up in the 1990s by essentially countries that abut the Arctic region, with the idea that we needed a forum for dealing with particular issues, many of them environmental, that are playing out in the Arctic. And as far as I know, this was the first multilateral organization to actually give representation to indigenous communities. And now what I don't know is how that has, if we talk about the meetings of the Arctic Council, how meaningful has that representation been? Has that formal representation actually led to adequate voice in the Arctic Council? I haven't seen a lot of reporting about that, but it was certainly a notable multilateral achievement to have that voice represented in the Arctic Council. But overall, I would say not very well represented. So
everyone loves pirates. So let's talk about, well, we love the lore, the mystique around pirates. Piracy is a very, very real and a very, very dangerous thing.
Yeah.
Economic deprivation, fragile states have seen piracy rise in places like Somalia, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Malaysia, Nigeria. Is there significant multilateral cooperation to control this? And whose issue should it be in the freedom of the seas?
Yeah, so this is a tension that we get at in general in talking about freedom of the seas, and has existed, since ancient times. Of course, as soon as maritime activity became significant, you had violence at sea. And so keeping that violence down or under control has been a challenge since ancient times. And of course, there were Roman commanders who made their name by, suppressing piracy in the Mediterranean and keeping the grain flowing to Rome. What we see is a lot of what you could call ad hocery when it comes to piracy. That as pirate activity starts to become significant, you get various forms of cooperation that come together to try to suppress it. And you saw that, for example, in the 1990s, you had a real upsurge in piracy near the Strait of Malacca. And then over time, over the next few years, various governments in the region worked together. They figured out a joint patrol scheme. There was some aid to provide more resources for the coast guards of some of the smaller countries there. The area where you saw the most elaborate multilateral cooperation on piracy was off the coast of Somalia. You mentioned that, of course. And that was an area where piracy right now has been significantly reduced, but was becoming quite endemic. And obviously a vital shipping corridor, right? Because you've got the Suez Canal and then the Red Sea, and then that flow of maritime commerce. There you had, not only did NATO dispatch a naval task force, you had a European Union initiative, you also had the UN Security Council get involved and issue resolutions that gave those forces combating piracy the right to go into Somalia's territorial sea. Because one of the problems that people trying to tamp down piracy were finding is that pirate vessels would engage in their piracy beyond the 12-mile mark, and then would hustle back inside of Somalia's 12 miles. And then at that point, legally speaking, a US Navy destroyer or something couldn't chase them. And so you saw UN Security Council action to try to create a legal pathway for international forces to suppress piracy. That, I would say, was the kind of, if you want to call it, a high point of international multilateral engagement on piracy. A lot of what we're seeing now is, back to the kind of ad hoc methods, which I don't mean to say aren't effective. Sometimes they are, and piracy has a tendency to kind of pop up in one region, be suppressed, and then pop up in another region. One area that's getting some attention now is off the coast, is the Gulf of Guinea, the coast of West Africa. That has seen a number of different piracy and maritime robbery attacks in recent years. It's become more significant, really, than off the coast of Somalia in some ways. So
I read a recent piece by Ian Urbina, who runs the Outlaw Ocean project, which if you have not checked out the Outlaw Ocean project, great reporting.
It is fantastic reporting.
This was in the New Yorker, but it was on the dire situation of refugees apprehended at sea off the coast of Libya and Italy's complicity in their detention and torture. How is the international community addressing this? And how should the US engage around this?
Yeah. Now, and I should mention, I feel like every talk I do, I end up plugging Ian Urbina's book sometime, but he had a book called The Outlaw Ocean, which is great, and compiles a bunch of his reporting on the oceans. The question of maritime migration and the response to it is another one of these areas that opens really interesting legal questions. Now, what was happening for a while is you were having a number of vessels coming, many of them leaving from Libya, coming out into the Mediterranean, and then making their way to the Greek islands or to Italy or where have you. And there obviously was enormous pressure in Europe, but in those frontline countries in particular, to figure out some way of stopping this. And there were a couple different methods that have been attempted, including interceptions out in the middle of the Mediterranean, essentially. Now, from a legal standpoint, this gets quite murky. In general, freedom of the seas means, hey, if there's a vessel transiting across the Mediterranean with migrants, that vessel's not supposed to be disturbed. I mean, it has the freedom of the seas, so long as it's a properly registered vessel. But if it's not flagged by any country, okay, so if it's a stateless vessel, then actually there is the right to board it. Or if it's unseaworthy and it's essentially in distress, there's actually not only a legal right, but a legal obligation to offer assistance. The legal gap that a lot of these European countries have taken advantage of is that legal convention about vessels in distress does not say anything about where you need to deposit people rescued from the vessel, right? It just says, basically a place of safety. But many of these European Coast Guards that were intercepting these vessels were then depositing people back in Libya. Or in a few other places, but essentially taking them back to their point of origin. And their argument was, well, they're no longer in distress at sea, and so we've put them back in a place of safety. But as the Urbina reporting and some other reporting has shown, the situation for many of these would-be migrants in Libya is appalling, and they're subject to all sorts of abuse. That the other tactic that has been used is to really beef up the local coast guards of, for example, Libya, equip them, provide them with intelligence so that these interceptions happen much closer to shore. And then you've got the Libyan Coast Guard putting these people back. But the human rights situation is obviously very grave for these would-be migrants. And it's in some respects, it's a much bigger question than the maritime rules. It's a question of how our country is going to deal with mass migration, but it has played out on the oceans in a number of different ways. You would remember that the United States, of course, encountered this issue with Haitian migrants on the high seas, and ended up intercepting a number of those vessels and depositing people at Guantanamo or returning them to Haiti. And then the Australians also dealt with this issue, and there was a very well-covered incident where Australia turned back a vessel crammed with migrants. So migration at sea has become a big challenge for the existing legal framework.
So when it comes to current maritime disputes and kind of geopolitical flashpoints, in South China Sea, Strait of Hormuz, the Red Sea, Gulf of Aden, the blockade of Gaza, is there any way to disentangle national territorial claims from international politics in the discussion?
Yeah, I mean, the area where this might be most ripe to discuss would be the South China Sea, because there you've got a lot of the rhetoric about what is going on in the South China Sea is about the maritime rules, right? The United States saying we are out there defending freedom of the seas, and China is violating the rules by claiming rights in this broad area of the South China Sea. And so a lot of the framing of what's happening there is about the maritime rules. But the obvious political backdrop is, of course, the rise of China and the increasing tension between the United States and China. And one of the things I try to do in the conclusion of the book is not to rebut the US rhetoric on this, but to try to argue that the US rhetoric or that the situation is significantly more complicated than the US rhetoric about freedom of the seas over there indicates. And there is a deeper issue about disputes over how to interpret maritime rules that is playing out in the US versus China dynamic, but really goes much deeper than that. So if we look, for example, at other countries in that region, there are a number of countries that have adopted or have on their books maritime restrictions on, say, what foreign militaries can do in their exclusive economic zones, that the United States does not think are compatible with the international rules. But those disagreements have been essentially kind of suppressed vis-a-vis these other countries, and they've kind of agreed to disagree. But with China, it has become a real flashpoint. And so I don't think you can fully disentangle the kind of legalities from the international political realities. And the reason that a lot of these frictions are becoming so aggravated with China is all about the geopolitical competition. Now, that said, the US does have a certain view of the rules of the sea and the law of the sea, that it does try to push and it does try to encourage other countries to follow, friend or foe. But there's no doubt that that geopolitical backdrop is making that, that tension with China much worse.
So let's shift focus a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about trade.
Okay.
So shared risk has been an important part of international trade for at least 600 years, and certainly since the 16th century with the establishment of syndicates such as Lloyd's. To what extent have the contracts of insurance affected the developments of maritime law?
Yeah, and this is I talk a little bit about the development of Lloyd's in the book, and the role of the kind of private maritime insurance sector and how it has played out. One of the clear impulses that people using the sea for commerce have is precisely to share risk. And so if you look at maritime codes over history, some of the earliest maritime codes deal specifically with this issue of risk sharing. And I talk about the law of general average, which was a way of basically everybody who's transporting goods on a ship agreeing that, well, if the ship goes down, we're all going to lose something, but we're going to lose in proportion to how much we were carrying on the ship. So they've been, they've tried to deal with risk at sea. Lloyd's developed kind of it started like in a coffee house as a way of, different insurers trying to share information about the seaworthiness of different vessels. And it then became essentially over time much more elaborate. And then you had a major government effort under significant pressure from activists. And one of the activists that I describe in the book is a guy named Samuel Plimsoll, who is a kind of like a self-made man and a member of parliament, who really made the case that ships were dangerously unseaworthy, and pushed hard for national regulation of the maritime industry in a way that, met some pretty ferocious opposition from the shipping industry in Britain. And so you've had always this kind of private insurance sector, which tries to do a lot of the regulation on its own. And still to this day, an awful lot of the inspections on ships, particularly when we talk about, flags of convenience, a lot of the actual inspections are done by these private syndicates, these private, insurance enterprises, and not actually done by sovereign authorities. So that is very much part of the mix. But again, this issue of flags of convenience that I mentioned complicates things, because ultimately, in many cases, you are going to need sovereign authority if you're going to have effective regulation. And so I talk in the book about some of these shipwrecks or situations where you had dangerously unseaworthy vessels. And often the question came up, well, who did the inspection? And sometimes it would have been an inspection done by one of these private outfits. And that the sovereign government whose flag the ship was flying was simply not involved, or not involved in a meaningful way in the regulation of the vessel. So that dynamic between the private and the public sectors is very much part of the story today.
So what impact has COVID-19 been having on ocean shipping supply chains? I mean, certainly in Portland, we're all hoarding kale and toilet paper. Yeah. But I mean, how is COVID really influencing what is really working out to be in many cases food and goods insecurity?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's had an enormous impact. I mean, you've also just had a human impact, and there was some reporting that was done on this of essentially people being kind of stuck at sea, right? So ships where people were infected and no country was willing to accept the crews from those ships. And so you had some kind of harrowing stories of ships being at sea for long periods of time. That, by the way, is a dynamic that has occurred in other situations. It is not just a COVID situation. You've often had ship crews kind of stuck in a legal no man's land, where they passports may have been taken from the crew. Again, Urbina does some good work talking about some of these situations. But systemically, it seems to me that the major impact of COVID has been to demonstrate the vital nature of these maritime chains of commerce, which we have often taken for granted. And the other thing, of course, that reminded us of that was the blockage in the Suez Canal there with the Ever Given, where suddenly everybody remembered, oh my God, there's so much traffic that goes through the Suez Canal, and that canal is so vulnerable to blockage. That was something that people remembered well in the 1970s, because in the Middle East conflicts there, you had several different blockages of the Suez Canal, but I think people had allowed themselves largely to forget about the Suez. But I think the COVID then has really aggravated some of these supply chain issues, and you've had situations, obviously, of container ships, lined up at sea waiting to get into port. Some of that is, you probably have a better handle on this than I would about what's going on with some of these ports, but my sense is that some of that has started to unwind slowly now. But I would see its main impact then as reminding us about the absolutely critical nature of these maritime chains of commerce.
So from a trade and economic standpoint, how prepared do you think major economies are post-COVID for other potential challenges like decarbonization of shipping, increased environmental regulation? I mean, is this moment of supply chain gridlock just the beginning of something bigger? Are we going to see more hyper-localized economy?
I would be pretty skeptical about that. I think, and this is again just a kind of general sense, that people's instinct is going to be very much to kind of rush back to the way things were as soon as they are able to do that. So for example, I don't see that we would see major changes in maritime commerce patterns. I mean, one thing that I do think, and this is a bit of a tangent, but just to mention this, there is going to be pressure, speaking about Suez, there is going to be pressure to try to find alternative maritime routes. And here it is important to mention the Arctic passages and to mention the Northern Sea Route and the Northwest Passage, and the way in which shipping companies and private interests are going to see commerce through those as being potential ways around other maritime blockages and potential ways of saving money and cutting distance from these sea routes. And that then raises the issue of the legal status of those passages. And I try to detail in the book the different views that exist between, say, the United States and Canada, or Russia and the United States, about the legal status of the Northern Sea Route or the Northwest Passage. So that is something I'm very much, trying to keep an eye on, because I think it's going to be an issue that could really flare up in the near future, in part because of the reaction to COVID and the supply chain issues and the pressures that the shipping industry is facing. On the decarbonization front, I was reading some reporting recently about meetings of the International Maritime Organization, and you may have seen this as well. But there's been a push, for decarbonization in terms of ocean-going commercial vessels. And as you can imagine, the shipping industry is not very excited about this. And it seems that at a recent session of the International Maritime Organization, that they were able to kind of put the brakes on some initiatives for decarbonization there. But on the technological front, there have been some interesting innovations in terms of, believe it or not, kind of using modern versions of sail power again, and other innovations that can decarbonize or at least mitigate the emissions from these ocean-going commercial vessels.
So more than 50 million people work offshore. Roughly 80% of the goods we consume reach us by sea. Half the air we breathe comes from the oceans. What do you hope your book and an expanded awareness of the importance of this question of governance and ocean health will inspire for us, for audiences, for everyday citizens? And how can we all have more agency in this discussion?
Yeah, well, I think I would describe my aims as fairly modest, in the sense that in large part, what I would like to do is to give people an understanding of how we got where we are, and how these existing frameworks for the ocean came about. Sometimes the very convoluted, very controversial past of some of these ideas that are kind of taken for granted, or that are kind of part of the wallpaper of conversation about the oceans. And so I think if I can give people a good sense of that historical context, I will feel pretty happy. Now, that said, I do think we are at this moment now where we are really transitioning between different worlds. We're transitioning between a world where freedom of the seas was the kind of governing doctrine for the oceans, and something else. But what that something else is very much undetermined. And it could go in multiple different directions. You've got, for example, some ways in which management of the oceans is now being internationalized, is under international control, but it is very fragile. And these institutions that have been put in place are very fragile, including things like the tribunal that was created for the law of the sea, and this International Seabed Authority, which is supposed to manage mining on the seabed. These things are really just experiments. The other possibility that is out there, and I don't think this is a good possibility, but I think it's something that people need to be alive to, is the possibility that this historical trend toward coastal countries just claiming more of the oceans could continue. And that, what the current legal framework might have been only a kind of temporary pause before governments who have increased means, increased technologies, and perhaps increased motive to claim more of the oceans, before they move on to the kind of next stage of taking control of more ocean space. And that's a very complicated thing. Some of it might be done for very good reasons. Some of it might be done for environmental reasons. If you look at, for example, some of these South American countries who are watching large fishing fleets hover right outside of their 200-mile mark and hoovering up fish, those governments might have a real incentive to say, well, look, we're going beyond 200 miles, notwithstanding what the convention says, and we're going to do that because we want to protect this resource. So it would be a very complicated, destabilizing and process with very mixed motives. But I don't ignore the possibility that we might just see more of that, more of kind of carving up the oceans between different governments. So if I can give people a sense of that dynamic, I think I'll be pleased. I think when it comes to like activism and kind of what people can do, I think I will have done my job if I can have given them some more of the historical context.
Great. Thank you so much, David. We're coming up on the hour. Again, the book is The Poseidon Project, The Struggle for the Governance of the World's Oceans. I want to bring Derek back on to bring us out into the day. David, thanks again for great conversation. Thank you to the audience for your questions. And Derek, it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Tim. Thank you, David, for the great discussion. Encourage people to pick up the book. In fact, I just ordered it for my son while we were talking because it sounds so interesting. Hope you can join us tomorrow when Great Decision kicks off. Just put the information in the chat for either the series or the individual event. As Tim said, there's some parallels with ocean discussions about outer space. Also, love to get your feedback on today's event, posting also in the chat, and this hopefully will pop up automatically with Zoom, the survey about today's program. So David, thank you for sharing your time and your expertise, and look forward to partnering you on future projects.
Thanks, Derek and Tim, and thanks to the participants.
Thanks, audience. We'll see you tomorrow.